I did a thing and I want to tell you about it, so get ready for another long and drawn out vlog where I talk about my experience with doing a survey on a subreddit. Hello and welcome to another video. So today I wanted to just talk a little bit about my recent experience in conducting a survey on the sample size subreddit and go through the entire process of how I came up with the questions, how I got my responses, going from actually cleaning up the data to producing the visualizations, before finally posting all my results in a way that actually looks alright. So we're going to cover quite a lot of ground today. And that is despite leaving quite a few things off the table. I'm not actually going to delve into interpreting the results. I've already done that. I've already produced the write-up on this topic. So you can go refer to that. I'll put a link in the video description. But yeah, essentially these are all the things that we are going to cover today. Firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about why I did this. This may not be of extreme interest to you, so you can skip past that if you like. Then we'll talk about preparing our data, putting everything together into a form that allows me to analyze it further. With everything in place, I can then talk about how I actually crafted all the questions, how I actually processed the data. Some of these questions I'm not super satisfied with, so I'll talk a little bit about my areas of improvement as well. After which I'll talk about my experience publishing it, and then just a few words to wrap things up. So that's all we're gonna do today. Like I said, it's a lot of ground to cover. I have over 90 slides, so I expect this video to be quite long. Jump ahead if you want to. I'll set up timestamps in the video description, and you should find them on the seek bar as well. So let's start by talking context. Now, what's happened is recently I've taken over a course at one of the institutions that I teach at. Well, actually I used to do half the course already, which involves all the data analytics and machine learning, but now I'm involved in teaching the other half as well, which involves data collection, data visualization. Surprisingly, as I went through the material prepared for me by my predecessor, the assignment itself, one of the places it tells the students to go look for data is a subreddit called samplesize. And the thing is, I've been using Reddit for quite a few years now, but I've never known of any such community. So yeah, naturally my interest was piqued. I went over to the sample size community and I realized that, hey, it looks quite promising. But before I officially recommend it to my students, I would like to have a feel of what it's like to actually post there. I mean, ultimately the least I could do was to, well, get the experience of what it's like actually using that subreddit so that I could guide them if they needed it. So I knocked together a simple survey. While mainly it's just for me to get a feel of how things are going to be like, I crafted it as a way to know the community a bit better. I thought this was a great chance for me to understand exactly who the community was made up of, how they found the community, as well as things like what's their perspective towards actually answering surveys on the community. Because of course the whole point of the community is anyone could post a survey there, anyone could respond to it. Well, as long as you fit in the required demographics. So I was very curious to see how this entire sort of dynamic actually played out, and that's why I set out my first survey. So I set up my survey, I waited a while, and to my surprise, within 6 hours I got over 300 responses. I was honestly expecting 30. I did not expect there to be that many responses. So yeah, that's cool. I excitedly downloaded the data, I started playing with it. There were some columns that needed some annotations, so I got started with that. And that was when I realized that, hey, I need some procedures to get things to work together properly, which allows me to transition nicely into my first part for the day. One of the first tasks I had to do was to prepare the data for analysis, and this is especially important for questions in which there are open-ended elements to it. Here's an example of that. You can see that in this question, there is an other option. So yes, while quite a few of the responses were just the selections that is easy to process, what you'll find is that some of the responses need to be processed further. And I think this is a very good example of this in action. These two really mean the same thing, right? That is, the respondent does not remember, but they're not written the same way. So the solution would be to actually tag it. I'm essentially creating new categories on the fly as I'm looking for the other responses to see what's in common between them. Hopefully at the end of the day, I just end up with a set of categories and I can count how many people fall into each. That's all well and good, but this leads to a small problem. Like I said, I was looking at my data before all the data was collected. In other words, what I have is an annotated spreadsheet with a certain amount of rows based on the number of entries I had at the time where I downloaded it. I added, in this case, 4 extra columns to, well, tag whatever data there is. Now, later on, if I wanted to pull more data from my form, well, I can do that. It's updated, there are more rows now, but the problem is the extra data columns are missing. So merging these two spreadsheets together is not quite as straightforward as it seems. Here's how the merging process needs to work. I couldn't simply just knock the two spreadsheets together because everything will be misaligned, right? My annotations column in my original spreadsheet will now line up with the second column of data from the original spreadsheet, and that's gonna make everything go off. So there needs to be another way of doing this. I need to create a new file, and it's going to have to be smart about pulling columns from each of these spreadsheets. That is, it's going to pull the first data column, and it's going to join it to the data column that came from the new data. If it sees annotated rows, it's not going to try to merge anything to it. It's going to have to leave that part blank. Then rinse and repeat. Now everything is off alignment, but the technique should still be able to put together and associate appropriate columns with each other. So in this case, we have our second and third columns joined together, with the annotated column again joined to nothing. That's the only way in which you can have all the columns, which remember represent values entered in the survey, to line up correctly. In order to do this, I've actually had to write some Python code. So this is using Python and the Pandas library. I've been using Pandas a fair bit recently for some classes. So what you're seeing on screen is how I loaded up both the files and created them as Pandas data frames. That's basic. But I think what's more important is to figure out how the columns have changed between the two files and to associate them appropriately. So here's my approach. First, I started out by pulling out the columns of the annotated dataset. So that should have a couple of extra columns. I actually represent that as a Python set. Then what I do is I do the same for the raw data, again representing the columns as a set, and I do a set subtraction, a set differencing. This set differencing will give me essentially which columns have been added to the annotated dataset, assuming that I didn't remove any columns in the annotated dataset, which, yeah, it's something I didn't account for, but it's something I know I didn't do. So it's forgivable. Anyway, I take that, convert it to a list, and what I now have is delta columns, the columns that have changed. What I can then do, knowing which columns have changed, is to add these columns into the new or the output file. What I'm doing here is I'm simply rearranging them so that they look the same as the original annotated dataset, and then all I have to do now is to write what I've just created to a file. So in fact, I would say the more important lines are these two: figuring out what the new columns are, extracting their data and inserting them into our output file, rearranging them so it looks the same, and then writing it. So I was able to use this method to progressively work on the data as more and more data came in. That way I didn't have to wait until the entire survey was closed before I could start working on the data. Now, I technically didn't have to do this because the new columns that were added were fairly consistent. I could do it entirely manually if I wanted to, but this is a generalized solution. If you've added new columns, this can figure out what the new columns are and then merge everything properly so that everything stays intact, filling in with blanks as required. So yeah, pretty happy with this script. But let's move on and talk about our analysis. Remember, my original goal was to figure out the quantity of responses that I was going to get. So I wanted to analyze and see how many and how often. So let's start off with that. Let's start off with analyzing the response rate. Typically in a situation like this, you want to break the data down into based on units of time and then figure out how many per unit of time. Thankfully, the timestamp of each response is actually recorded down, so my approach would be to actually split it all into buckets. Each bucket represents an hour, and then what I could do is I could take a count of how many responses were given per hour. So that's not too difficult. I knocked together another simple script, and again read out the file, and then try and bin up the timing. How I did that was I simply looped through the entire data frame, visited the timestamp column of each row, and what I did was I took the time, I replaced the minutes, seconds, and microseconds to 0. So what I'm left with is the date, which is important, as well as the hour of the day, which is also important. Essentially, that's how you decide which bin this data point goes into. So yeah, at its simplest, your code will look something like this, right? Out of this dictionary of bins, find the one that matches this modified timestamp and increase its count by 1. Of course, you have to sort of account for the case that the timestamp doesn't actually exist in the dictionary just yet. So I added an if statement so that if the timestamp is not in the dictionary, then we'll create it, setting its value to 1 since we counted 1 here. So that's how we are able to populate the bins and count up as required. Of course, as the days progress and less people respond to the survey, what do you think happens? Well, certain hours no longer get any responses. Right, in these cases, we still want those bins around. We still want that particular hour to be accounted for, just report the count as 0. But if you were to follow the algorithm shown previously, you'll realize that that doesn't happen. If a particular hour doesn't come up, then it's just not reported. It just doesn't exist in the file. So I had to augment my code a little bit further. What I'm doing here is I'm figuring out the timestamp of the first bin and the last bin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to loop all the way through, going through all the hours between the first bin and the last bin, including those that aren't actually represented. In fact, that's what I'm doing here. If that particular timestamp was not found in the dictionary, then create it anyway, setting the count to 0. This solves my problem. The rest of the code is just there to put everything in order. I won't go into too much detail, but ultimately, here's the result. What I now have is a set of timestamps as well as counts for each bin. This allows me to knock together a very nice visualization. This is the waterfall chart in Microsoft Excel, and I found it to be a really meaningful visualization. What I had wanted to do was I wanted to use bars to represent each hour so we could get a feel of how many responses you actually get per hour, but I also wanted to see the total at the same time. So in fact, this kind of captures both. You can easily tell the total number of responses collected up to any given point, and you can also see at a glance how many responses were collected at that hour. So I think this is a pretty cool visualization. Of course, the issue here is that the responses drop off quite early. So in fact, what I did was over here I zoomed into the first 24 hours. Now, in total, I had the survey open for about 3 days. I collected 896 responses. But you can see that in fact, within the first 24 hours, I've gotten close to 850 responses. And what that means is the majority of responses came in within the first 24 hours. Now, that's another thing I want to mention about this particular visualization. Didn't seem like anyone on Reddit really commented much about, well, this scale at the bottom, which essentially shows time in 3 different time zones. These are actually based on the 3 most common time zones. We'll talk about that in the demographic question. And yeah, I had this nice little effect going on where I colored the squares different colors depending on the time of the day. So yeah, night colors are blue, and the colors sort of transition into the day, and it's white, close to midday. Nobody really commented about that. And here's the dirty secret behind how it's actually made. This is just a screenshot of an Excel sheet. Yes, I had the grids turned off. These are all actually cells with manually filled in colors. I had to resize the graph itself so that it's roughly the same width, made its background transparent, and then yeah, just took a screenshot of my Excel sheet. That's how I got those colorful little legends in place. This is just a screenshot of Microsoft Excel. So yeah, fun story. This is not the first workaround I actually did to get things to look exactly the way I want. But again, we'll talk more about that as we move on. Anyway, now that we're done discussing that, let's talk about the questions themselves. I essentially asked 3 sets of questions. The first one were demographic questions. Then the second set was more about how the respondent discovered the subreddit. And the third set was about their behavior when it comes to answering surveys. So in this part, we'll talk about a couple of things. We'll talk about how I actually constructed those questions and if there are any areas of improvement, which, spoiler, there will be many. I'll talk a little bit about how I processed the data so I could analyze the responses, and then we'll move on to talk about how the visualizations themselves were actually generated. So let's start with the demographic questions. These are the 3 questions that I asked: age group, gender, and location. Let's start with the age group question. perfect for me to illustrate the point that turns out making a visualization is not quite as straightforward as just plotting y against x. And here's what I mean. My original thought was it's a plot, right? Just plot everything. But turns out that's not the case, because if you were to just plot everything on a set of axes, here's what you'll get. You'll get, at this time, this person gave this response. At the next time slot, another person gave another response. So on and so forth. What you're getting is not an easy way to understand general trends. What you're getting is seeing individual responses, which is not what we want. Instead, what we want is an aggregation. We want to group together all the people who actually made the same response and then count how many people did that. What's interesting is Excel does have a recommended charts feature that does figure that out for you, but if you want to do it yourself, you can still use PivotCharts. I'll be very honest, pivot tables was a thing that I was never really very comfortable with until after doing this. With a pivot chart, essentially it will do aggregation as required, it will do counting and summation and averaging as required. So yeah, it makes this kind of analysis much easier. I was able to say insert pivot chart. I had to set the actual response as both the rows and the values. And yeah, Excel automatically generates a count of them. And now I have a count. This allows me to go ahead and plot out my visualization like so. So I'm just going to talk about this process once, even though I used it quite a few times for quite a few different multiple choice questions. But yeah, it turns out, just to get a plot like this, there are additional steps involved. Next up is the gender question. One of the important things I wanted to point out is other is important for this question, for the sake of inclusivity. So what's nice about this is Google Forms actually generates this for you. So I created a survey in Google Forms, and when I typed in just the question, these were the suggested options that it actually gave me. As you can see, it's pretty important because 8% of the population actually did choose the other option. Just like before, what I've had to do was to go ahead and tag whatever is entered under the other option. And I thought a great way to present this, right, so that other gets its representation as well, is to go ahead and break it out using an exploded pie chart. Exploded pie charts are really nice because you can actually zoom into a portion of your main pie chart and to show the values there, rather than trying to cram everything in and make those values not quite as easy to look at. I actually always thought that Excel's exploded pie chart was entirely automatic and you had no control over it, but turns out that's not true. You could actually say you wanted to split the series by custom, then you can select a particular series and move it from one plot to another. Yeah, basically show off your data in the exact way you want. Next up is the location question, which is one of the questions that I'm really not very happy about. For example, I actually had to add the Middle East option later on because I thought it was captured within the Western Asia option. So yeah, lots of areas of improvement here. First things first, as mentioned, Middle East option was not added at the very beginning, and I'm not sure how this affected the results. Europe as an option is very broad, I should have broken it down further. Turns out it's not easy to handle this sort of question. You don't want to make things too granular, but you also don't want to create too large groups, and I don't think I found a perfect balance here. The alternatives that I had in mind perhaps could be something like to have a full list of every country. I did not want to do this because it's going to be quite difficult to set up. I was really hoping that Google Forms would have that pre-populated for me, but it does not seem to have that. Maybe I just didn't use the right words in a question to trigger that list to appear. I'm not so sure, but having to manually answer it is probably a little bit too labor intensive. I was thinking probably a good compromise would be to use time zones. So you can have a world map, split it up into its however many time zones there are, and selecting a time zone will give us at least an idea of sort of which latitudinal slice you are in. It's an interesting thought, but I know time zones don't perfectly correspond to location. Then you need to account for things like daylight savings time and so on. Yeah, it's not an easy question to get right. Anyway, these are my results. Vast majority from North America and Europe. Should have broken down Europe further, but didn't do that, so we don't have enough information here. Alright, let's move on to the second set of questions, which involves the discovery of the subreddit, as well as sort of general behavior, usage patterns, so to speak. Again, the first question I wasn't too happy with because on asking how users of the subreddit first discovered it, I realized that some options were far too granular, whereas others were a little bit vague. I also didn't put in an I don't remember option, which led to quite a few users manually typing that. I had to add it in later and then just try and find all the responses that are equivalent to I don't remember and do the mapping. When I got the results back and just looking at the style of the questions, I realized that, because of the vastly differing levels of granularity, that turns out it was kind of a blessing in disguise. Not really, but it allowed me to do something interesting with the data. I realized that there is almost a hierarchical kind of structure. You see, it turns out you could sort of spread things out into, at the beginning, 2 big categories: the people who remember and the people who don't. Out of the people who do remember, what I could do is I could figure out how many of them discovered the subreddit on Reddit itself and how many off Reddit. Regardless of whether you're on or off Reddit, right, we could actually break each one of these down into different ways of discovery within that category. So there is this hierarchical structure. And while I originally wanted to do a tree, I think that was a little bit too abstract, too computer sciencey, so I looked for another alternative. I was clicking around in Excel and I realized that, hey, there is this thing called a Sunburst. Now, a long time ago, I actually did a project involving visualizations. That's the first time I heard about Sunburst, and that was almost like a headline feature. It's really cool because you could, easily break it down. You could see categories, you could sort of browse a hierarchical structure, and yeah, the meaning comes from however deep you delve into it. So I thought it would be good to sort of apply it in this context, so I thought that would be a good direction to go into. I cleaned up the data by remapping all the other options. Of course, I had to fix up the I don't remembers. Some of the options given were actually really just one of the options that I let you select. So I just mapped those back to existing options, and where there are new suggestions, right, where there are new responses that couldn't really be captured by any existing option, then again, I created new categories. So remapping, right, anytime you have open-ended questions, that's something you have to do. So after generating the remapped values, what I had to do was I had to generate a new column. If there was a value remapping, then take my remapped value. If not, then take the original. So basically, this particular column now gives me all the categories that I'm looking for, including the new ones that I've created. This allows me to move forward easily. I'm no longer sort of confused by the open-ended responses. Because the Sunburst involves breaking everything down into categories and then subcategories going forward, what I did was I generated a set of helper columns to make it a little bit easier to reason about the values. As you can see, the helper columns give you true or false depending on some condition, and I could then later very easily count if they're true or false to tell me how many people fall within a certain category. So what I did was a couple of simple Excel formulas to figure out the values for these two columns. I realized that in the case of the remembered column, unless it says I don't remember as a response, the respondent does remember. So it's easy to set. We just say, if it says I don't remember, then it's false. They did not remember, otherwise it's true. This is a little bit convoluted. I could technically just write it like this, but I don't know. I'm always slightly iffy with this symbol, so I didn't. Regardless, the meaning is the same. As for the within Reddit column, what I did was something like this. This essentially breaks down to a couple of parts. The search function would search the selected cell for a particular keyword. What it does is it gives you the index, it gives you the position of that word. Unless that word doesn't exist, in which it gives you not a number, NaN. Of course, in this case, I don't really care about where the word is. I just want to know if, it exists. So as long as the word Reddit exists within a response, it means they found out within Reddit. In other words, as long as the search function gives me a numerical value, not NaN, that means it was able to find the value. So what I did is I checked to see if it is a number. If it is a number, then yeah, the response includes the word Reddit. And that's how I generated my two helper columns. All that's left to do now is to create the Sunburst visualization. This is the kind of format that Excel is actually looking for. So these are sort of the levels of the hierarchy, and within each level there are, your individual subcategories. So this is the format Excel actually wants. So I selected this and I said go, and this is what I got. Not exactly very pretty, not exactly very readable, but it does have sort of every basic thing you need out of a Sunburst. It just needs some tweaks. Unfortunately, Excel itself doesn't give me many tools to tweak this and make this look better, but to be honest, I'm already this far committed into the Sunburst visualization that I wasn't about to go look for something else. So yeah, I just exported this, put this into an image editor, and then cleaned it up. So yes, this particular visualization that you are seeing, it looks nicer, I hope. All of it was done in GIMP. Going off the original Excel base, I had to in fact remove some of the text, retype it, and even draw the little breakout plots as necessary. Definitely not the smartest solution, but because all I have right now is Excel, I'm not going into something like Tableau or whatever, so this is the best I could do for now. Regardless, I hope you agree it came out looking quite good, quite happy with this. So yeah, I would just go with this. If I ever needed to do a whole bunch of Sunbursts, then of course I would find a better way. But since I was only going to do one, this is fine. Doing it manually is not so bad. I also had to manually recolor everything. I tried to use colors that would sort of tell a story as much as I could. Like I said, I think it turned out alright. Rinse and repeat, I think you're getting the idea now. For each one of the questions, I just went, I should have done it differently, but then, well, I have no choice now, so remap the responses, do a pivot chart, and produce a visualization. Rinse and repeat. I think I would only comment on how I could make the questions better. For this one in particular, which asks respondents, how they respond to the surveys, I tried to do a thing where I forced respondents to pick one, right? I said best describes, I hope to force people to make a choice. Well, turns out some really couldn't make a choice, they just had to pick more than one option by typing something in the other field. So alright, I guess I tried. I was able to force most people to pick just one choice, but not everyone did. Another question was this one, which wanted to use to find out how people actually saw posts from the subreddit. Unfortunately, I used the word front page, which means different things to different people. Despite the fact that I've been using Reddit for 6 years, well, turns out some of the terminology I still don't really get. So unfortunately, I had to reinterpret this question to be whether people browse the subreddit directly or see it in a feed with other posts, with other subreddits. It's unfortunate, but I think I made the best out of the situation. Then finally, survey preferences. This is the third section in the survey, and this is probably the one that I was the most interested in, because what I wanted to find was, is there a pattern as to what kind or what style of survey would get the most responses? In other words, what are the types of surveys that people were the most willing or even more interested to answer? I even had a hypothesis for this one. I imagine people preferred shorter, simpler, more fun, more chill surveys rather than those that were heavy or long or complex. So I wanted to test my hypothesis. These were the 4 questions I asked. One based on length, one based on the tone, as well as some miscellaneous options that, thinking back, I'm not so sure about. In fact, I'm not so sure about this entire thing, especially after I saw the responses that came back. Even at the time of crafting these questions, I sort of had an internal debate as to what was the best way to do it. I eventually settled for this, not because I thought it was the best, but I just kinda got bored thinking and just went for the path of least resistance. But I would say it is a fair middle ground, even though you realize that we put more emphasis on these 2 points and less on these. These are actually on a scale, these are not, so it definitely could be improved, and I wanted to walk through some of the ideas I actually had at that time. Of course, the simplest solution would be to break this out into many questions and put everything on a scale like that. But there are some pros and cons to doing this. Of course, it's great because all the nuance gets captured, but is that really necessary? And is that really appropriate? You see, the thing is, in this particular case, the scale is poorly defined. What is very short, what is very long? And the thing about Google Forms is it doesn't allow you to sort of label each one of these individually unless you use a different interface. We'll talk more about that. There are also some questions that just don't make sense. If I wanted to find out whether people liked simpler surveys, I still couldn't phrase it like this because who on earth is going to say, yes, I like complex surveys? there is almost a negative connotation to the word complex in this context. So it's like I'm creating a biased question to start off with, and I wasn't very comfortable with that idea. So I scrapped this and considered another alternative. How about a series of checkboxes? Now, this is fairly easy to understand, it's fairly user-friendly, right? Read the statement, if you agree, tick it. Sounds good enough. It's easy to set up, it's easy to answer, it's great. Except of course, again, we lose the nuance, because how short is short? Would you prefer those that are slightly longer but still not extremely long, right? There isn't a way to capture that. And also, there's an issue of, with checkbox questions, everything ends up together in one text box, and more processing needs to take place later on, which is less than ideal. Well, I did have a checkbox question so we can see exactly what that means, but I thought this was not too bad of an idea, it's just that we lose the nuance and, kind of feel bad about that. Of course, there is sort of a simplistic solution to that, and that would be just to add more checkboxes. Right? I can have shorter and longer as both options, I can have simple and thorough as both options, so on and so forth. Of course, again, there are pros and cons. While this is certainly better at capturing nuance, it becomes more complex. Potentially, this could end up being a very long list that the user needs to read through one by one. It sort of loses the simplicity of having a set of checkboxes. You also cannot stop a respondent from picking contradictory options, right? Nothing stopping someone from ticking both shorter and longer. Now what? And also, what if someone ticks neither? Did they just leave it out? Did they just forget? Or did they just disagree with both statements? So it does still leave some room for interpretation, which is not good. Another alternative will be to have a series of scales. So for each one, you could say, well, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And yeah, I guess this is not too bad of a middle ground. It captures nuance. It allows me to ask very specific questions. But again, there are still difficulties in interpreting the results that come out of this. What does it mean to somewhat disagree with preferring surveys that are shorter? It's not a very great answer. It's probably wise to sort of limit such questions so that, yeah, you don't just get a page full of radio buttons. It could be quite intimidating. Anyway, ultimately, this is what I settled for better or for worse, so let's take a look at how I actually processed the results that came back. Nothing too complex with the multiple choice questions, right? Essentially, you just pivot chart them. But for the checkbox question, you can see the problem here. Because essentially, the user could pick any number of responses, right? Including 0, including all 3. If they only pick 1, they could pick different ones, right? If they pick 2, it could be different combinations as well. So it's really unclear exactly what has been picked. And it takes sort of a few steps of processing to actually check clearly. The method I used was ultimately to actually split it out into 3 different columns. Again, these are true or false columns depending on whether the user has actually made the choice for that particular entry. Luckily, it's just a bit of simple Excel formulas. All you have to do again is to use this formula which we've seen previously, search for whichever string it is. If it comes out to be a number, that means that they did actually choose that option. So yeah, for each of the 3 columns, we would just do each one of the statements and just fit it into this formula. That's it. That allows you to create your 3 columns of trues and falses, and from there, I was able to just do a count and generate a nice graph. I thought of using stacked graphs like this because for every question, we'll just take it that everyone in the population did vote. And since we wanted to see how many yes responses and how many no responses, then yeah, let's just display everything. By the way, there's a little trick here that I haven't talked about very much, and that is the notion of custom labels. Some of the previous visualizations did use this as well. You see, on the chart itself, we have the number of people who actually made the selection, as well as, in brackets, the percentage of people that actually is. Turns out, Excel doesn't always do that out of the box, which means we need to build this value ourselves. Luckily, not too difficult. Let's just look at the yes column for now. Right, so what I've done is I've made a count of how many people chose that particular value. I've computed that as a percentage of the overall population, and this is the result I want to produce, which is again the value, space, in brackets, the percentage with a percentage sign. So here's how I did it. I essentially used the concat statement, which stands for concatenate. It just means join things together. And yeah, I just plugged the 4 things in place. Starting first with the count itself, followed by a space and an open bracket. This is just a string of fixed values. Again, pull the percentage from its relevant cell, and then add a string to finish it off. So I used a concatenation like this to build the final value. What I could then do is, in the data labels panel, right, I can say I want the label to get a value from a set of cells, select the appropriate range here, and that helps us populate the values. So yeah, that's how we deal with our checkbox and our multiple choice questions. This leaves the best for the last because yes, now we're going to talk about how I actually process the open-ended questions. My last question was a free-form long answer question for respondents to actually specify what changes their preferences about answering a survey. I had slightly under 300 responses here, more people left it blank, but yeah, for these, I had to somehow break them down so we could understand them better. Again, my approach involves manual tagging. What I did was I've created 4 more columns, and for each of the columns, I just read through the text and, well, if I saw something that is worth noting, it reflects a concrete concern, I would write it down. I would tag it into these columns. This was not an easy task, and there were a lot of things I had to be mindful about. Firstly, I had to create a minimal set of tags, right? The more you have, the more messy things are going to be. At the same time, I didn't want to sort of squash or misrepresent any of the concerns there. So it's about finding a balance of having appropriate tags that are representative but not excessive. Of course, to make things easy to process, they also had to be correctly comparable. And by that, I had to make sure that capitalization was consistent, spelling was consistent. And the whole point of doing this was to avoid a situation in which I would have 2 tags that were supposed to mean the same thing, but maybe because of a spelling or capitalization error, they got treated as 2 different things entirely. I wanted to avoid that. So yeah, I took extra care to make sure that they were consistent. And then I also wanted to give interesting responses the attention they deserve. And for that, I actually created a separate column to mark out responses that were interesting that I could potentially comment on later on. And so I did that, and I ended up with about 19 to 20 different tags. What I've done is I've turned an open-ended question into a categorical one, and that allows me to use code and count how many of each response there is. So as usual, take in a file, and in this case, I'm going to extract just the 4 columns with my tags for me to work on. I would also create a dictionary so that I could store the tags and associate them with their counts. What I then did was to loop through each and every single cell within those 4 columns of tags, and the objective here is to populate the count into the dictionary. That is of course assuming it's not blank. If it's a string, if there's actually text there, then we will do the logic, which consists of converting it to lowercase. Remember, consistency is key here. And then just like what we did earlier on with the binning, we would say, if the value already exists within my dictionary, then simply increase the count by 1. Otherwise, add it in to the dictionary with a count of 1. So counting is essentially what we're doing, but we're going through the cells in the spreadsheet and we're counting unique entries. So yeah, with all this, we can write it to a file, and let's take a look at what we've gotten. So these were the tags that I've actually created. These are the counts generated by my script. And yeah, with this, what we can do is we can analyze the main concerns that respondents actually typed in to the text box. For this, I opted to use a visualization called the tree map. The tree map is an interesting way of showing things by just using areas of shapes. More frequent concerns will get bigger areas, less frequent concerns will get smaller ones, and everything is nicely automatically color-coded, which yeah, makes it easy to read and interpret. We are almost done here. I've recorded over an hour of footage already, but yeah, let's move on to my final step, which is uploading the results onto Reddit. Knowing that Reddit uses Markdown as a way of formatting, I opened up Visual Studio Code and started typing up a report. The reason why I use VS Code for this is because I could create a Markdown file and write it up, and at the same time I could see a live preview of what it looked like. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I could even put in inline images and yeah, have everything look really nice. And then I posted it to Reddit only to find that yeah, my inline images didn't appear. Turns out that's not default. Again, I shouldn't have known better, but I don't post on Reddit very much. But yeah, it turns out you only get text whether you're using the old interface or the new one. and that just didn't look very good. It just didn't work the way I wanted it to work. So I thought to come up with a solution. Either I could produce a PDF for the viewers to download. I thought that's probably not going to be a great idea because, yeah, there's a barrier to entry there, right? We just saw from the survey results that people want things that work well on mobile, still got to look good and work right on desktops. So PDF kinda out of the question. And turns out if you want something that works well on all platforms, you use the web. So I was thinking, well, maybe I can knock together a Google Docs document, but yeah, I wasn't really sure about that. I really didn't want to rely on Google any more than I needed to. So, well, turns out maybe I just do it myself. I'll just make a web page. I ended up using GitHub Pages. Turns out what you could do with GitHub Pages is, just push to a repository and your pages will be served right off your GitHub repository. So I thought that was pretty cool. Of course, my original page was written in Markdown. So this is where I want to give credit where credit is due to markdown to html.com. That really saved my life. I just had to paste in my Markdown. It gave me HTML. So at least I didn't have to painstakingly reformat my document, so to speak. Of course, what I got was a page with no styling, so it didn't look great. All the images went off screen. Yeah, I had to write a little bit of CSS to get everything to look and work correctly. I wrote a fair bit of CSS, but I'll just focus on the more functional ones because I think you've been sitting here listening to me long enough. The first thing I did was to actually constrain the size of the page. It's generally not easy to read a document that's sort of just filling the width of your screen, especially if you're using, a widescreen monitor where you have to just read from left to right. So what I did was I constrained it to just the column. It's 1080 pixels across, so you should just be able to scan it like this rather than, having to go all the way across. By using margin auto here, I could get it to actually centralize the column by generating appropriately sized margins automatically. So that's one nice thing about CSS, you can just do that and it'll get centered. There was also an issue of images being too large, so what I had to do was just to say width is 100%. In this context, 100% is relative to its container. Of course, that's the body of the document, right? So it would fit within that little column that I've created. That's just nice, it wouldn't go beyond. So I pushed the code up to GitHub, I tried it out, it looked alright on PC, and then I looked at it on my phone and no. It would still fill the screen because the size specified here is 1080 pixels. So I had to add this very interesting media query. This is like if statements in CSS. What I'm essentially saying here is that if we're looking at this on a screen with a width less than 1280 pixels, then the body would just be 85% of the screen, no matter how wide or narrow that screen is. And this is the final result. This entire operation probably took me like an entire week on or off, with the collection of data, with the analysis, with the writing of the scripts and the scrambling to get this page to work correctly. What an undertaking. But it's absolutely worth the time because I'm still completely floored by the amount of response I was going to get. Like I said, I was expecting 30 responses. So yeah, I thought the least I could do was to do the data justice. Anyway, that's it. There you have it. This video has gone for way too long, but hopefully it gave you some insights about what it's like to actually create a survey, process the data, get the visualizations to look exactly how you want them to look, compile everything, and then upload it. This has been a crazy journey for me. I probably wouldn't do it again, but it has been a great experience. But yeah, if anything, hey, at least now I know what it's like. Now I can guide my students better. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for bearing with me for this very long video, but I hope it has been, an interesting, insightful experience for you. Maybe you've never done something like this before. Well, now you know how it feels like without having to do it yourself. Maybe you're planning on doing something like this. Hopefully, my experience here will guide you. Learn from the things I did right, but more importantly, learn from the things I did wrong, especially when it comes to crafting of questions. I think there are many interesting takeaways on that front, because you want to be as inclusive as possible, you want to capture data that is as meaningful, as broad as you possibly can, and only in that way can you gain meaningful insights from that data. So yeah, hope this has been an illustrative experience, but I'm gonna go now because I've been talking for a really long time. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, you're watching 0612 TV with NERDfirst.net. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video and are feeling generous, a donation to this channel will be greatly appreciated. There's a link on screen and in the video description for more details. Meanwhile, please do like, comment and subscribe. This helps the channel tremendously and gives me the means to do more. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next time.